I'd like to show you how to do a shadow now on an irregular object, but using a different technique. I have my light bulb and I would like to cast a shadow off to the side. And when I cast a shadow off to the side, it's going to be darker here at the base of my light bulb, go off in the direction that I would like to cast my shadow. It's also going to fade, and it's going to get softer and more diffuse the further away from the object it is. So instead of going in and command clicking on my mask to get my selection here, I'm going to go in and I'm going to click on my layer, the layers panel, go down to my layer effects, and I'm going to choose the drop shadow function. And I apply a drop shadow to my object. I'm going to make it very dark, so I can always screen it back on my layer. And of course, using the layer effect drop shadow here doesn't give you anything of what you want. Actually puts a drop shadow behind the object and doesn't look realistic. Well, this is exactly what I want, because once I create this drop shadow effect, I'm going to use what I've just created and turn it into a separate layer. So over in the layers panel, I'm going to right click on my effect that I've just created. Down at the bottom of my right click drop down menu, I get create layer. And now it's going to break out my drop shadow effect into its own layer. With this, I'm going to distort this. So Command T, I'm going to right click, I'm going to do a distort. I'm going to grab the top handle and I'm going to lay it down at the angle and the distance that I would like to cast this shadow. I'm going to park it right underneath there, and however I want my shadow to be cast, I distort the whole thing. Notice I'm not using perspective. And I'm going to set my drop shadow. So I have my drop shadow. It's very dark, right? I can always go in and control the opacity. So I can set that so I can have that shadow light or dark. But I want it darker at my object and then lighter going out. So that's going to require a mask on the shadow layer. Click on the shadow layer, click on the layer mask, and in order to get this to blend, I'm going to use my gradient tool. And because I am on a mask, my gradient is going to go from, in this case, hide to show, because of the black to the white. If I reverse this, that's going to be from show to hide. So on my mask, I'm going to take my gradient tool, and it's now set from show to hide. I'm going to click here on my, right there, and you can see, and I'm going to go from my show to hide on my mask. So right there. And what this does is it allows me to go in and take my drop shadow and blend it from seeing everything on there to seeing everything go off in the distance. Now another thing that happens when I have a drop shadow, it's going to be much more precise coming off the object, and it's going to get softer and softer coming around. So I want to go in and I want to keep it nice and tight down here, close to the shape, and then have it get diffused, not only as it goes from dark to light, but as it goes further away, this is going to become more diffused. So this is the tricky part. I can go in and I can take my layer and I can create my Gaussian blur filter. If I do that, it blurs the entire object and everything around it so that my drop shadow doesn't look real. So I'd have to go in and do some fancy selections to kind of isolate the areas to blur some more than the other. What I'm going to do with this is I'm going to use what's called my smart filter. If I go into my filter menu, I'm going to convert my layer for smart filters, which is actually turning this layer into a smart object. So I have my drop shadow layer selected. I'm going to convert for smart filters. It tells me to re-enable, select the layer, convert it into a smart object. I get it. So in my layers panel here, when we look at this, we actually see this is now a smart object. Well, a smart object is nothing more than either a placed or an isolated object in Photoshop. I still have the ability to edit my mask and my drop shadow by clicking on my Smart Object button. And with this, I actually get my drop shadow with my layer mask, and I can adjust this any way that I want to. When I'm done, I save and close out of this file, and it actually puts this back into Photoshop. So in essence, the Smart Object is an actual saved file within Photoshop. So I've taken my layer and turned it into a Smart Object, or converted it for Smart Filters. And now I'm going to apply my Gaussian blur non-destructively. This allows me to apply the blur to my object. And when I do this, this is going to give me the blur on my object. And it also applies a mask. So I'm going to double click on my Gaussian blur here to call out my dialog box, and I'm going to blur this a whole lot. Now clearly you see here by the light bulb base it's blurred too much, but I'm liking the blur all the way out here. So with my mask, this allows me to mask my filter so that I can control how much blur. And again, what I'd like to do is have no blur here at the base of the light bulb and all the blur right here. So with this mask, I'm again going to use my gradient. And on this mask, I'm going to, with my gradient right here, it's going to go from show to hide, which is exactly the opposite, because what I want to do is I want to hide my filter where it's going to go ahead and be close here. So I'm going to click off the reverse, and I'm going to go from my hide to show up here. And on my mask, I simply click and I drag, and that allows me to mask my filter. Do that, get a little bit of softness there. We can see now I have my layer going from harder to soft. And I can also set the opacity of this so that I have my mask coming off the edge. Now let me zoom in real quick, and we can see that at the bottom it looks like it's hovering because I did not put in my anchor shadow. So this is going to be my anchor shadow. Take my brush and go in and put in my anchor shadow down there so that it actually applies. Actually, I need to make sure that this is not more in the red but more in the black, so that's what I was using. I apply that to the bottom of my object, so now it looks like my object is actually having the shadow anchored right there. So there is my drop shadow coming off at an angle and being able to cast that with it being masked here to be dark to light, and then my smart filter, which is controlling how much blur and where that blur is happening. So no blur here, a lot of blur at the end, and added my anchor shadow.